Since 2007, Wisconsin Eye has filmed countless hours of state capitol coverage to provide invaluable access to government actions, all available to watch live and on demand. Without Wisconsin Eye, Wisconsinites would lose an important source of transparent and unbiased accounts of public policy and politics. Give today to secure the longevity of balanced, unfiltered civic programming. You can do so at wisci.org/donate or text WISI to 44321.
Welcome to tonight's great event. My name is Eric Wilcox. I have the privilege of being the Dean of the College of Letters and Science here at UW-Madison. On behalf of on behalf of the college and all my colleagues, welcome you to this great event. This event comes at a very auspicious moment, and Alex and I were speaking briefly a little bit before. Today, this very afternoon at about 1 o'clock, our campus Chancellor Jennifer Mnuchin, announced a new initiative on our campus called the Wisconsin Exchange. And I'll read you a little bit of the purpose of the Wisconsin Exchange. And it reads, at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, we are advancing civil dialogue by cultivating a community where diverse viewpoints are expected, debated, and respected. And in an era where disagreement often means disconnection or division, this institution is focused on encouraging ongoing engagement and fostering the robust exchange of ideas. And tonight is all about that. And in many ways, from auspicious timing, this is somewhat the inaugural event of Wisconsin Exchange. So well-timed, Alex. So it is a pleasure to have you all here. It's a pleasure to have this great panel here to join us. And so without further ado, let me introduce tonight's MC and host, Professor Alex Tock, a professor in the Department of Political Science and the director of the Tommy G. Thompson Center. So Alex, thank you for hosting this, and welcome.
Thank you, Dean Wilcox, and to the College of Letters and Sciences. And good evening, everyone. I'm really excited for tonight's conversation. Let me start by briefly introducing what the Thompson Center is. The Thompson Center was founded to follow in the footsteps of Governor Tommy Thompson, who proudly worked with colleagues on both sides of the aisle to advance the public good. In seeking to carry on Governor Thompson's legacy, the Thompson Center works to foster effective public leadership through public events, research grants, scholarships, and other activities across the UW system. Tonight's event is a conversation I've been wanting to have for a long time. I felt that we, especially on campus, talk too little about the role of faith and how we approach politics, and that when we do, we talk about religion more as an identity determining our vote or views on some hot-button issue. And I wanted to step back from the ultimate policy or vote implications and ask how faith can and should shape our political values and goals, and the limits of that. I hope this can be a real and ongoing conversation, not just with our speakers, but with all of you. When I started planning this event over a year ago, I had 4 speakers as my top choices, hoping to get at least 1 or 2 of them. Somehow we got all 4. So let me introduce them. So Ross Douthat is an op-ed columnist at the New York Times, where he has written since becoming the youngest ever columnist appointed by the paper in 2009. His columns, published on Tuesdays and Sundays, cover American politics, religion, pop culture, and intellectual life. He serves as a film critic for National Review. One of the most provocative and influential voices of his generation, Douthat is credited with helping the conservative movement find new relevance in the 21st century America. He is the author of 7 books. His newest book is Believe, Why Everyone Should Be Religious, and was released earlier this year. Shadi Hamid is a columnist at the Washington Post and a research professor of Islamic studies at Fuller Seminary. From 2023 to 2024, he was a member of the Post's editorial board. Previously, he was a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a contributing writer at The Atlantic. Hamid was named one of the world's top 50 thinkers by Prospect Magazine. He is also the co-founder of Wisdom of the Crowds, a podcast, newsletter, and debate platform. He's the author of 5 books. His newest book, The Case for American Power, which will be published in November 11th, I believe, by Simon & Schuster. Daniel Mark, is an associate professor of political science at Villanova, where he teaches political theory, philosophy of law, American political thought, and politics and religion. He also served for 4 years on the 9-member bipartisan U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, most recently as chairman. In addition to his academic writing, he's published on topics related to international religious freedom in many prominent media outlets. He recently released his first book, The Nature of Law, Authority, Obligation, and the Common Good, that addresses the question of when and why we have an obligation to obey the law. Danielle will be giving a talk on that book tomorrow at noon at the law school, and I hope you will also consider joining us for that. Last but not least, Kaitlyn Schiess is an author, speaker, and perpetual theology student. She is currently completing her doctoral work at Duke Divinity School, and her writings have appeared in many prominent media outlets. She is co-host and senior editor of the Holy Post podcast and the host of Curiously Kaitlyn. She is the author of 2 books, The Ballot and the Bible, How Scripture Has Been Used and Abused in American Politics and Where We Go From Here, and The Liturgy of Politics, Spiritual Formation for the Sake of Our Neighbor. So thank you all, Ross, Danielle, Shadi, and Kaitlyn, for being with us here tonight.
We've put the moderator in the most uncomfortable chair. Just...
As it should be.
It's an elaborate hazing. We're actually not going to speak for the entirety of the next...
Well, I have plenty of questions, so you can just ask them all night. All right, so we start with, in some ways, what I think is most directly led me to want to do this event. So public policy always enforces someone's values. Laws wouldn't be laws if they didn't bind those who disagree with them. Yet most of us prize religious freedom and a separation of church and state. It's wrong to force others to worship as we do. But how far does that principle extend? After the Dobbs decision, Rabbi Dana Ruttenberg criticized, quote, making one religion's idea about when life begins into policy. Not everyone agrees that abortion restrictions cross that line. But where is the line? Not on abortion specifically, but in general. How should a believer know when their moral convictions legitimately shape law and when they risk imposing their faith on others? So, start with you, Ross, if you're willing.
Sure. I called up the Office of the Inquisition in Rome. They provided me with a long and complex list detailing all of the ways in which non-Catholic members of the audience have fallen short and all the laws that we should know. Sorry. All right. A mild laugh. So it's an incredibly difficult question that Americans have been struggling to answer for going on 250 years. I think, the basic phrase that I like to use, that's by no means original to me, is that the United States has historically had separation of church and state without having the separation of religion and politics. And so we have done a pretty good job of avoiding imposing doctrinal claims, theological claims on people who don't share them. And then we have had a rowdy, long-running, multi-century argument about when it's okay to impose moral claims that are shaped in some way by religious ideas and arguments. And you can see this running through, obviously, debates about slavery and abolition. You can see it running through debates about the social gospel in the late 19th century. You can see it running through debates about prohibition, which I think by consensus is sort of the case where people today are likely to cite it as an example of religious overreach, because prohibition, interestingly, had sort of progressive and reactionary elements kind of combined, but nobody wants to sort of to claim it today. I'll defend it if pressed, but, in spite of being a Catholic. But right, prohibition is a case study. Obviously, the civil rights era is a case study. And running down to the present day, debates about abortion are also a case study in sort of arguing back and forth about when strong moral claims become an imposition of morality. My general view of this question, which is by no means satisfying because it doesn't tell you what you actually do in concrete circumstances, but my general view is that the United States sort of constitutional system is broadly neutral on a lot of big moral and metaphysical questions, but it's kind of a framework that can be inhabited by different worldviews working through the same constitutional structure. And so you can have a kind of, not a hard establishment of a particular church, but a kind of soft establishment of a general world picture often associated with some kind of religious perspective. And that for much of our history, that soft establishment was basically Protestant, with Catholics and Jews and non-believers and certain kinds of, distinctive kinds of Protestants, Mormons and so on, all as kind of outsiders trying to figure out how they fit into that kind of...
You forgot us, Ross.
And, well, right, no, well, we can... The question of when Muslims enter fully into American history is being litigated every day on social media. But yes, there were Muslim claims and arguments about Islam from the beginning as well. But I think since the 1960s, basically, when you had a kind of breakdown of what used to be the Protestant establishment in American life, you've had a lot of different forces trying to fill that role. And, if you lived through the George W. Bush presidency, a lot of Republicans and conservatives thought that there could be a kind of Catholic, evangelical political alliance that in some versions included even conservative Muslims, especially before 9/11, that would kind of provide this sort of new religious framework. That sort of dissolved and came to grief with the Bush presidency. I think we've lived through a period just now where a officially secular, but in fact, in my view, kind of theological progressive vision has tried to sort of provide a kind of moral superstructure or framework for American life, and it too has come to grief. But I think it's also very hard for a society to get along without some kind of broad framework, because you just, there are certain questions which are the great vexing questions, right, that are really hard to answer if you don't have some broad consensus about, what is good and what is bad and what is the destiny of human life. But it feels to me like we're in a kind of interregnum with different groups auditioning to play the role that mainline Protestants used to play, but no one has quite been capable of doing it.
Yeah, I think for much of the 20th century, there was a predominant liberal progressive view, which was that if you have religious claims or moral claims that derive from religion, that you keep them private, that you can express them in your church, mosque, or synagogue, but once you enter into the public sphere, you have to use secular arguments or so-called rational, reasonable arguments. I mean, this view is probably most closely associated with John Rawls, probably one of our great political philosophers of the 20th century. I think that view ran into a wall. First of all, it wasn't realistic. If you have deep religious commitments and someone tells you to keep them private, are you really going to be able to keep them private? Is it fair to expect you to keep them private? I'm of the view that if you have strong religious claims, you should be able to express them fully and unequivocally in the public sphere. Now, where do you draw the line? The only line that we can all agree on is the Constitution and legality. Obviously, you can't impose something on someone outside the bounds of the law. But as long as you're operating within the legal framework, within the democratic process, I tend more towards a no-holds-barred kind of approach. And that can sometimes lead to very uncomfortable territory. If you have people who are trying to ban abortion on the state level, I personally am pro-choice. I don't like that. But I have to respect their prerogative. If they're able to get a majority in their state assembly to vote a certain way on abortion, we have to live with that. Elections are about consequences. And that, I think, is the real challenge in America today, is how do we live with democratic outcomes that we find personally threatening? And we're living, in the biggest sense, we're living through that right now with Donald Trump, who I consider to be personally quite threatening to the future of the republic, but he won fair and square. He is our president legitimately. So we're going to have to live with that whether we like it or not. That's the kind of test of democracy, I think.
Oh, sure. Maybe to open up some disagreement, and I'm certainly not going to defend Rawls. I don't want anybody to accuse me of it. Nope. Here we go.
The ghost of John Rawls has intervened.
Right. Don't want anybody to accuse me of defending John Rawls. But I think one of the ways to draw the line, I mean, the Constitution. So fully on board with the Constitution, except, of course, the Constitution should change. And the way I would say it in class, thanks. I'll skip it back. The way I would say it, in class is let's not just think about what the Constitution is, but what the Constitution should be. If we were writing the First Amendment, what would we have it say? And I think that the first part of the answer there is to challenge maybe the premise that Rabbi Danya mentioned in the quote that you gave, is that laws on abortion aren't imposing one religion's view. In either direction, actually. Laws on abortion in either direction are the fruit of different, when at their best, are the fruit of different reasoned arguments. That's what philosophy is for. That's in a certain intellectual tradition I associate myself with. That's what natural law is for. And what we owe to our fellow citizens is offering them reasons that they could, at least in principle, accept. And that is what distinguishes politics as the pursuit of justice and the common good from politics as sheer power and number. Well, we have the majority, so we win. And so maybe I have a disagreement with Shadi, though I suspect that on some of the particulars here we might agree. And this is not the problem with Rawls. There's a lot of problems with Rawls, but Rawls' idea of neutrality was wrong for reasons anybody wants to talk about. We could talk about it. And Rawls was also wrong in the way he artificially circumscribed what was allowed in as a reason. But here, if you can offer your fellow citizens reasons, then you can do that. And being pro-life does not in any way depend on being Catholic or Christian or even religious. And I think that, and maybe where there's a disagreement with Shadi is if a majority comes up with something, and this may in fact be related to the ongoing question, the open question of Muslims, though not only Muslims, but Muslims in public life in America, is if a majority comes up with laws that they want to impose properly through coercion, through the force of law on others, but can't offer their fellow citizens reasons other than this is part of my theology, then I think there might be an argument that those things are, and I'm not claiming that Muslims are currently doing that, but for any religious group to do that, I think is possibly improper and why it's so important. Now, just a final note on that, to be clear of what I have in mind here is I'm willing to happily endorse William Wilberforce, who in England was a major leader in Parliament against slavery, and then Martin Luther King here, the civil rights hero, who everyone knows, right? So both of them were deeply religious, deeply motivated by their religious beliefs in the equality of every person, and from Genesis, that every person is created in the image and likeness of God. But they also, in a letter from Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King quotes St. Paul and Jesus Christ, but he also quotes Socrates and many other thinkers. And that it was valid because he was speaking from his own religious tradition, as he should, but he was also offering his fellow citizens reasons that they could accept even if they didn't accept his theological premises.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree with both of you in the sense that I would desire to live in a community in which people can make distinctly religious claims because it's more truthful, and also a society in which we would desire, out of, speaking as a Christian, out of a kind of hospitality towards our neighbor, to couch those arguments in terms that they might understand and relate to. I also just want to give, as a different answer to this where the line could be drawn question, a really distinctly theological, maybe even perhaps distinctly Christian answer. When I'm approaching questions of where do I think the line should be drawn, I tend to go back to how in both the Old and New Testaments, there tends to be a distinction between the kinds of demands that God makes on the people of God in particular, and the kinds of demands that God makes in general. And I think this might end up mapping on to some of the line that you're describing as well. In the Old Testament and the prophets, this line tends to be, okay, the nations broadly in the prophecies against the nations are not condemned for not keeping the law that's given to Israel, but they are condemned for how they treat people made in God's image. I think going back to the Noah covenant made with all of creation, they are required to keep that covenant whether or not they're required to keep the specific laws that Israel is given. In the New Testament, I think there's something very similar. There are both really strict demands made upon the people of God in the church that are not made on the larger culture. But then there, for example, a sexual ethic that as a Christian I would say requires not only a community of faith to uphold, but also the indwelling of the Holy Spirit to make possible and plausible to you. But then there are other demands outside of those particulars that are made to the larger world, not just to the people of God. So I say that as an example to give, I think there are constitutional arguments that can be made, but then I think most religious traditions, and I, speaking as a Christian, I know intimately from my own, have a line that makes a lot of sense outside of the kind of popular rancor around Christianity in particular in public, have deep theological resources to say, not only do I want to make particular religious claims for my own ethics versus the larger ethics that I would want, to be legislated for our community to uphold, but also I have a theological basis for offering those in a different mode. I have a theological basis for saying I want these gifts that I believe my community holds to be offered as an act of hospitality and gift rather than an imposition or an act of coercion. But those lines are not just drawn, I think, to your point, Shadi, along the lines of what is constitutionally permissible, but they're often drawn along distinctly theological lines as well.
Yeah. So let me ask something, at least partly about where we're headed. American religious freedom has traditionally been about limiting government, but not banishing religion from public life, a separation of church and state. By contrast, the French have a broader idea of laïcité, which is more a separation of religious society and civil society. Are we moving towards something more like laïcité, and how we approach this in American society, and should we?
I think we're moving towards more Christianity in public life just by virtue of the MAGA movement and Donald Trump being in power. I mean, I think that anyone who watched the Charlie Kirk Memorial saw a very public and somewhat aggressive form of Christianity being displayed. But I think there were also two versions of Christianity that were sort of in tension with each other. Erica Kirk, Charlie Kirk's widow, talked about forgiving and loving one's enemies. And then right after she was on the stage, Donald Trump goes up and says, "This is where I disagreed with Charlie Kirk. I hate my opponents and I want to defeat them," so on and so forth. So I think just in those few moments, you saw a real debate within Christianity, which is, do you take more from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, the idea of the elevation of the weak over the strong, or do you take this Donald Trumpified version of Christianity, which emphasizes the strong over the weak, and which almost elevates power as its own distinct good? And that's not really for me to kind of resolve that. That's up to Christians to kind of have that intramural debate and figure out what is more Christian, what is true to their own faith. But I think part of the problem is that the rest of us are affected by that. So it's not just a Christian debate for Christians to have. All of us are going to be a part of it because the future of America depends on the future of Christianity. If we go towards a more brutal, aggressive, cruel even version of Christianity, that's not going to be good for America in my view. So I think the next few years and few decades are going to be quite fascinating in that regard if Republicans keep on winning elections and if you continue to have a version of the MAGA movement in power. And Democrats are really good at losing elections, so it's totally plausible that Republicans will be in power for the foreseeable future. I mean, we'll see, but I think a lot of it will hinge on which form of Christianity wins out in that internal debate.
I'd say I agree with much of what Shadi said, but I think it's worth sort of recognizing that it's kind of an unusual environment where a certain kind of public Christianity is making a comeback on the political right, but not because Christianity has sort of gone from strength to strength over the last 10 or 15 years. The story of 2000 to 2020 in American life was a story of America becoming substantially more secular, less Christian, and, for all the talk about Christian nationalism and these kind of things, if you actually look at polling on how Americans and American Christians think about religion and politics, Christian nationalism was actually stronger when George W. Bush was president, right? It just feels more vocal now, in part because Christians, maybe conservative Christians, feel more embattled, but also I think because there's just been this kind of general fragmentation of culture, where there was sort of a moment maybe in the late Obama years when you might have said, we are moving towards like more of a laïcité model, where you're going to have this sort of, this conservative Christian minority and this secular progressive culture that sort of wants to keep them down in a bunker. But the secular progressive culture has itself sort of cracked up and fragmented, and you have all kinds of weird religious and cultural tendencies sort of running all over the place right now. And in that environment, you can have, it's easier for conservative Christians to sort of speak their truth in the style of the Charlie Kirk rally, because there's no general consensus to sort of, serve as like a dominant alternative. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't confuse that with Christian nationalism is about to take over America, because that does not seem to be what's actually happening, demographically or numerically or anything else.
Along the lines of what Ross was just saying, I feel like there is such good and bad about the fracturing of this kind of shared moral consensus. I spent a chapter in my most recent book comparing the 8 prayer breakfast speeches of George W. Bush and Obama. And the funny thing is I went into that research thinking I just kind of wanted to write a chapter about presidential relationships to faith. These are two presidents, one's a Republican, one's a Democrat. They both have 2 terms. One very public Christian and some, lauded as a Christian president. The other spent most of his presidency trying to refute the claim that he was Muslim. And so, interesting contrast, I just thought. But what I was so surprised by was, if you look across the 8 prayer breakfast speeches of George W. Bush, for being such a public Christian, I don't know if y'all remember that Time cover where he's like Jesus on the cover, like very, supposedly very Christian president. Across his 8 prayer breakfast speeches, the most public opportunity for a president to talk about their faith, he never once says the name of Jesus Christ in any of those 8 speeches. And yet Obama, in one of his in his first term prayer breakfast speeches, talks about the nail-scarred hands of Jesus and putting his faith in the nail-scarred hands of Jesus. I don't say this to say Obama was a more Christian president than Bush. I bring it up to say that there's such a shift in the ability that Bush had to say there's this broad kind of Judeo-Christian, whatever that means, moral consensus. And so he would avoid any particular Christian claims. He talked a lot about faith. A lot of times he would quote something from the Old Testament, from the New Testament, and kind of say this is across, and sometimes from the Quran, there's a across these largely Abrahamic traditions, some consensus. He very rarely mentioned any other religious traditions, and he really focused on, at the end of the day, we kind of all believe the same things, essentially. Whereas Obama mentioned more religious traditions than Bush ever did, quoted more scripture than Bush ever did, and was more specific about his own Christian faith than Bush ever was. And I say that to say, on one hand, there is a kind of nostalgia we can have for, even if it was not total or complete, a shared moral framework that we could rely upon. And yet, in spite of the threats of Christian nationalism and our great political polarization, I look at the Obama model and wonder if there is a greater gift there for us to retrieve in terms of, does that specificity of the tradition I am coming from, not looping everyone into just kind of we all believe the same things, but being very specific about where I'm coming from, acknowledging the gifts of other traditions even if they are not my own, not claiming them to be my own if they are not. If that is a better model, that as much as I share a criticism of Christian nationalism, might want to say along the lines of what you were saying, Shadi, is that then an opportunity to say, let's have an intramural debate about who gets to claim this as Christian public witness and not claim it as American civic religion, but as a distinctly Christian witness in public that will be different even if it is complementary with a different religious tradition's public witness.
Yeah, I think first I'm broadly in agreement that to borrow a phrase, secularization is not happening, and it's bad if it is. And right, the trends that we saw of, there is some kind of possibly a reawakening, a turning. Maybe it's a political ascendance of the right. One thing that I wanted to mention, I think, is maybe insofar as it is true that the ascendance on the right or of the rise of the MAGA movement, insofar as that is directing the future of Christianity in America, it is, I think, in a certain way, a little more of a nuanced picture. It's interesting, the contrast between Erica Kirk and Donald Trump. Well, Donald Trump barely even claims to be a Christian, and very few people claim him as a Christian, even though, of course, he's closely associated with a certain wing of Christianity in America. But more broadly, and this is, we were actually just talking about it before, but in the news, there was a big controversy over the Politico story about some 30-somethings and the young Republicans who were, a lot of off-color, I didn't actually read the article yet, but I've been busy preparing and traveling and all of that.
Luxury of the academic life.
I don't really have to read anything. And so I said, political theory, we just make stuff up. That's what it's for. And then you have the head of the Babylon Bee, Seth Dillon, writing even more recently and in the Free Press, saying that it's very important that the right police its own. And the fracture that I've been seeing and tracking for quite some time now, I don't have perfect names for them, but there's something like the nationalists, not the national conservatives, they have a brand already, but the nationalist conservatives and what I've been calling the Catholic conservatives. There's a kind of an ongoing, a great debate within the right and an ongoing tension between the people whose view of politics is that we must win at any cost. We must, and for whatever the left does to us, we must return it twofold and so on. And then there are other people who, in my view, rooted in a Christian worldview, although Socrates told us the same thing, is that there are worse things than death. It would be better to be a martyr than to commit an injustice. And I think there are a lot of, and part of the reason you have this fight going on is because there are a lot of people, and I think very much shaped by a Christian worldview on the right, who are not willing to sign on to the do anything to win project because they have this idea of, very starkly, of martyrdom, the idea that some things are just wrong. We have exceptional storms. We're not prepared to win at any cost. And I think that tension is going to continue to play out for a while, and I don't know where it will end. But I think that Christianity, in a lot of ways, is playing a very salutary, which is a healthy role on the right.
So I want to ask something that maybe underlies some of what you've all talked about now. So is there a danger that in bringing faith into politics, that politics flows back and reshapes our faith? So, for example, that we come to Scripture or tradition looking to confirm our politics more than for answers. And if so, how do we guard against that as believers?
I mean, I would say to that the same thing I would tell my students, which is we're human and confirmation bias is real, and we have to guard against that the way we have to guard against confirmation bias in any setting. And the two main ingredients, I believe, are free speech and intellectual humility. We need a very, very robust regime, and I mean free speech not just in the narrow legal regime sense of the First Amendment, which is very important, but a culture that really promotes the sharing, expressing, debating of ideas, because we always need to be confronted by the best arguments on the other side, on all sides, for the possibility that we're wrong. And as I said, we need enough intellectual humility to recognize that no matter how much certainty we have, we might be wrong. My students said when I beat the moral relativism out of my students, and it's actually quite easy because they're not relativists even though they think they are, is to make sure that they'll say, well, if are you so sure that you're right? I say, well, on certain questions, like on questions of, and I pick an example I know they'll go for, like on racial equality, the idea that people are not worth more or less. I'm really, really, really sure that I'm right about that question, and I know you in your heart are too. I would say to my students, but in every subject, I have to have enough intellectual humility to be willing to entertain the possibility that an argument could come around and prove me that I'm wrong. Now, I'm not holding my breath on that particular subject, but on everything else, maybe I am wrong about abortion, and give me your best shot. And I think that's going to be true with faith and politics, and true everywhere.
Yeah, I tend to think that one really useful discipline that's actually quite difficult to practice, if you are if you're a religious person engaged in politics, we have a two-party system, a polarized country. It's very hard not to fundamentally be aligned with one coalition or another. Obviously, you can sort of step back from politics and de-align yourself. But if you're engaged, you're going to be aligned. So then maybe a useful test is, having decided that the preponderance of reasons means that you should be, as a Christian, you should be a Republican or you should be a Democrat, you should think to yourself, okay, but given that the Democratic Party or the Republican Party is not in fact God's chosen people, not in fact the new Israel or the old Israel, for that matter, right? Or the Ummah or any other chosen race you might want to pick, you should think to yourself, all right, probably the other side is getting something right. What is that thing? How important is it? And how can I make that awareness part of my politics, right? And so, in a different world 10 or 15 years ago, a good example might have been the evangelical Republicans who got really interested in and engaged in prison reform, right? Starting with Chuck Colson, the former Nixon hatchet man, and so on. I always thought that was a salutary example, even if you think, by the way, that they were wrong about the policy, right? And sometimes, there are some forms of criminal justice reform that I think can be a mistake. But even if you think they're wrong about the policy, having a situation where you are firmly on the right and yet you're engaged politically with an issue that is sort of coded to the left, that's a healthy sign for your engagement with religion and politics. And I think generally there are fewer of those. There never were that many, but there's, I'd say, fewer of those healthy signs right now. And which is, what you'd expect under conditions of polarization. But yeah, to the extent that I have an exercise to offer, it's that.
We've touched on this a bit. I think it is really worth emphasizing what happened from around 2000 to 2020, which was a profound decline in religious observance and attendance. So church attendance went below 50% for the first time in 2021. It had been hovering around 70 to 75% from 1937 to around 1998. Something has happened in the past couple decades. It seems to have stabilized now, and maybe there's a small uptick. But we are, as I think we've been saying, we are still living, if we look beyond the Republican Party and its internal debates, the broader society is still very secularized. Now, I think that a lot of us thought that that would be a good thing, that as America becomes more secular, we're going to become more rational, reasonable, we're going to deliberate over common ground. The opposite seems to have happened. So we really have to question our assumptions there, that the decline of religion in American public life was not a good thing. It led to more ideological polarization and fragmentation. Now, the question is why? Part of the problem is if you don't have religion to animate you, something else is going to have to fill the gap. And apparently what filled the gap was, I would argue, wokeism on the left and MAGA on the right, white nativism on the right. Other things had to take the place that religion had left. And I think people began to make politics their religion. They became obsessed with winning and defeating the other side. And there's actually someone who has a really great quote on this. He's actually here on this panel. I love this quote from Ross. I think he said it in 2016 in a tweet. He said, if you don't like the religious right, wait until you see the post-religious right. Yeah. And I think this is where Daniel, you sort of touched on this too. Donald Trump is not, at least as far as we can tell, a professed Christian. So there is something about this new approach that maybe uses Christian themes and pretends that it's defending Christian civilization, but it's not really about Christianity. And I think that it's sort of a lesson, be careful what you wish for. And if we can have more, well, it's not for me to, again, I don't want to say what authentic Christianity is, but if we can have... Go for it. But if we can, yeah, anyway. But I think that we could benefit from having more of a deep commitment to certain faith traditions if they're not beholden to politics. Now, how do you disentangle them? That's a challenging thing, obviously.
Along the lines of what both of you said, and I'm sure there's analogs in other religions, but speaking for Christianity, and I think this would have a great effect on not only the Christian right or the post-Christian right, but even segments outside of that. I think this would have a significant impact on more progressive streams of Christianity, of which I have been around for the last few years and noticed some troubling trends that seem to parallel a lot of what happens on the Christian right. Both, I think, would really benefit along the lines of what you were saying, Shadi, about like what is the richer theology beyond just the symbol or the identity that could truly motivate political action, that is more along the lines of the judgments I would want to make more faithful, would be a proper eschatology, in the sense of a proper sense of not just martyrdom, but of a belief in not only a life and a world beyond this one, but a divine power that will bring that about regardless of my ability to bring it about here and now, which in a past life of mine, in a pretty left behind, rapture obsessed evangelical past, I thought that kind of end of times thinking only motivates political quietism, because Jesus is coming back, so we don't have to do anything about it. But increasingly, especially in my research into the civil rights movement, I've become so convinced that focus, that real attention on the return of Christ to make all things new, has had a really positive effect on a lot of Christian political activity, because it has said, actually, not all political options are on the table for you, because if you die, you die. And there's this incredible documentary about MLK that has a shot of a few civil rights leaders streaming out of a church to go to a sit-in at a lunch counter. And even that image is instructive, I think, of along the lines of what Ross was saying. What are practices in a religious community that can temper the worst impulses of our political life, that can help us practice quiet and reflection and confession to motivate political action that does not lead so quickly to violence? But as they're streaming out of this church, a reporter asks one of the protesters, basically like, why are you even doing this? There's no way that your mission is going to happen. Like, you're going to lose. And the person leaving the church says, well, if they kill us, but God will vindicate us. And heard coming out of a different person's mouth, you might think that statement was cause for crusade, right? Like, I'm going to go out and be as violent as possible. But taken in, I think, I feel totally fine saying what a proper Christian theology is. I would love to make a judgment about that. I think a proper Christian theology, a proper Christian eschatology would say, because of the theology of if they kill us, God will vindicate us, it actually means unjust means to achieve justice are now off the table because there is something worse than dying. It is unfaithfulness. It is injustice. And that kind of framework that frames, that right-sizes your political activity, I could see that coming out of various religious traditions, but a sense not only of a life in a world outside of this, an agency outside of my own that tempts me to say I can cut corners just because the stakes are so high this time, but also just a framework that says there are some concerns in our political life that are really great, that deal with people's lives, both life and death and the quality of their lives. And then there are other political concerns that are not actually about that. And can a religious framework, a religious story about the world and where it comes from and where it's heading, right-size some of our concerns so it doesn't become our alternative religion?
So I think one thing that hasn't come up that much as far as the role of institutions, like religious institutions, whether local congregations or broader hierarchies, and the role they play and should play in how we think about how we bring our faith into our political values. So to what extent should we look to religious leaders, to a priest or pastor or rabbi or imam for guidance, and how much of this is work that must be done personally and individually?
I mean, I think we're living in a kind of uniquely deinstitutionalized cultural moment, and this doesn't just apply to religion, but it certainly applies to religion, where those, like, the sort of official voices of organized religion have almost no cultural authority that I can see. And there are specific reasons for this in specific cases. You know, the sex abuse scandal in the case of my own Catholic tradition is sort of a distinctive case. There are other scandals in other traditions, but it's not just about scandal. It's about the generalized moment, right, where, you know, people don't like identify with authority and hierarchy, even at like the sort of old-fashioned, you know, I have my pastor or minister or rabbi, and this sort of denominational approach to religion level that I can see. And I don't think that's good. I think it would be good to live in a world where it mattered what, you know, a Catholic bishop said or a prominent rabbi or imam said, because in part just because it's good for a democratic society, a free and pluralist society, to have a bunch of sort of points of moral and cultural authority distinct from politics. But I really have no idea how to get back to that world. I feel like we're living through a period, like in a way that will be up to, you know, Generation Z and people after that, right? That there may be some kind of successful reconstruction of institutional authority, but that's all bound up also in issues of like how we relate to technology and social media and the internet and so on, that are just really, really hard for, you know, the pastor of a local parish to solve. So I think it's a big challenge and uncertain answers.
I think there's a sort of intuitive religious message from, I think, all of our faiths to one degree or another. Now, whether it comes from a person in the hierarchy or not is maybe a different question, but I think, and you were gesturing at this, Kaitlyn, that at the end of the day, God is the only ultimate judge. And if we have that knowledge, then it allows us to chill, because we don't have to resolve political debates in the here and now, because we're probably not going to resolve them. So there's a sense in our religions of deferring judgment until the next life. That's why we have hell and heaven. It's because that's when the judgment will come. It's not for us as human beings to decide who's going to hell and heaven right now. In some ways, that's almost blasphemy, because then we're usurping God's role. We're saying that we are playing the role of God, that we can judge. So when Republicans say something like, to be a good Christian, you have to vote for the Republican Party, that should be called out as blasphemous. They are putting themselves in God's shoes and saying there is only one way to be Christian. We don't know that until the next life. And I think a lot of this is going to be revealed on Judgment Day, depending on what you believe, where God is going to be like, hey, this is kind of what I meant. You guys got it wrong. So I think that should give us some relief that it'll be clarified in due time.
So how does rising secularism or irreligion relate to traditional faiths? Is it sort of a competitor or replacement religion or something sort of qualitatively different? And especially, how does that change how Christians, Muslims, Jews, and others of faith relate to one another? Does it sort of create common ground, or does it deepen our sense of isolation?
I would start here first, I think, by agreeing with what Shadi was saying before, and there is, even if I'm disputing the premise about rising secularism and secularization in a certain way, certainly globally, I think we're pretty confident in the numbers, and I'm not a sociologist, so I'll leave that to others. But there is with a so-called God-shaped hole in every heart, and wokeism, whether it's, and I think this is a right or left thing, and you would put it well, I think there, that something will compete to fill that space. And so it will serve as a quasi-religion in a certain way, except it won't successfully fill the space. And that's why, if you don't like the Christian way, the religious right, wait for the post-religious right. And things like this were said about, Charlie Kirk was the nice version. That's kind of a way that people say that as well. And here, I think there probably is. Now, I'm not saying that we are specific. There was an earlier time, I think, where specifically, most prominently, Jews, Protestants, and Catholics were found maybe in the 90s was the heyday of making common cause against the more liberal versions of each of themselves and against secularism in general. But I mean, I think there is. I think it creates. I don't think it has been seized entirely, but I think it does create an opening for religions to say something like it sounded like we all agreed on, which is that a more secular country is not ultimately a better one. In which case, there's a certain way in which we're all in it together. I mean, also easy for the Jew to say as the non-evangelical religion, right? One that doesn't have a vision of a world that is everybody, and more what Kaitlyn was acknowledging of like, well, we'll do our thing, and everyone has the Noahide code or ethical monotheism. So it may be easier for me to say, but I think there's a way in which common cause makes sense.
I would similarly, have qualms with the secularization thesis, in part because 2 weeks ago on Duke's campus, there's a coffee shop across the street, and there was a bulletin board with 5 different witchy support groups that you could join. So there's lots of weird stuff out there.
Sorry, what?
Witchy. Some witchy support groups. Yeah. So the religious landscape is weirder and more complicated.
That's not really religion. Wouldn't that support the secularization thesis?
Except for the community group part of
comment.
it.
You don't.
And that's a really good question. But part of what's interesting to me about it is not just the interest in spiritual things, but the interest in pairing those spiritual things with a community. And I also then question, there's a lot of evangelical interest in this to sort of say, this is the inroad to bring people into the church, and I'm skeptical about that at the same time. However, in Durham, North Carolina, a very progressive city where there is the witchy stuff, but also there is some real resistance. A lot of community organizing in Durham happens in black churches, and Duke's, undergrad students will come in really excited to get involved in community organizing and then chafe at the idea that they should show up at a church because that's a violation of the separation of church and state. At the same time, in a context like that, I have seen some weird moments of more evangelical Christians who in the past would have been the last people to get involved in any interfaith effort, because that seems like some sort of denial of the exclusive claims of Christianity, get more involved with interfaith things, because if the alternative is a kind of militant secularism in a place like Duke, that's a terrible alternative. I had the very strange experience I live in a predominantly low-income immigrant neighborhood in Durham until very recently I did. And after living there for a year and a half, my next door neighbors, Muslim immigrants, one of the women living in that house came out and asked me if I was a traveling evangelist. Which I didn't.
Sort of, yeah.
Which I did, exactly. I suddenly sort of went like, "Am I a traveling evangelist?" But I asked her like, "What do you mean?" And she said, "You put a suitcase in your car really often and leave, and I have seen you carrying a Bible." And I was like, "That makes perfect sense. You put those two things together." And I had a conversation with her that was so surprising to me. She basically just said like, in this one little community, because the neighborhood we were in had a large Muslim population from a variety of Muslim majority countries. Other than in that neighborhood, she felt so strange in very progressive Durham. And in fact, she knew someone in her family who had moved to a different city in North Carolina that was very Christian, very Southern, and she just did it because she wanted to be around other religious people, even if they were not her religion. And so she was explaining to me, like, I'm really thankful to watch you walk out of your house holding your Bible, because she wears a head covering, and she was like, I have a very physical, visible sign of my religious faith that I take out with me in public life, and I appreciate that you do as well. And I just remember thinking, like, it was such a strange moment to realize that on one hand, there is this strange religious landscape in a progressive city like that, and at the same time, such a resistance to any institutional religious tradition that this woman was like, you and I have common cause. And it's not just that we're both religious, it's that there is something we are doing that is publicly religious. And I want us to share in that. And that, I think, is a positive thing.
Yeah. So I want to pick up on the sort of traveling evangelist idea. So many traditions do call believers to share their faith. But evangelizing can also feel intrusive and coercive. Some countries, even in Europe, restrict proselytization, at least to some degree. So how can people obey the call to witness their faith if they feel one, while still honoring the dignity and freedom of those who don't want to be converted?
So I'll just share a little story about this. So my colleague at Fuller Seminary, Matthew Kamink, is an evangelical theologian, and we collaborate on different projects together. And when we were first getting to know each other, we would speak at Christian colleges as kind of like a Muslim evangelical roadshow. And I remember the first time this came up from someone in the audience asking how I felt about Matt maybe potentially wanting to convert me. And I was confused because Matt hadn't been explicit with me about wanting to convert me.
You hadn't had the talk yet.
We hadn't had the talk yet. And when I found out, that it was kind of silly of me. He is an evangelical, so by definition, he evangelizes. Silly, I should have realized that. But it hurt me at first to think that someone who I was becoming closer to, someone who I counted as a friend, he wasn't okay with me just being as I was. He wanted me to change and become Christian. At first it bothered me. But then the way that he explained it to me is that, I don't want to convert him. It's a long story. I don't feel a need to convert people to Islam. But he was hurt by that because he said, Shadi, if you believe you have the truth, wouldn't you want to share that truth with your friend? And when I thought about it that way, it gave me a little bit of a different perspective. It's out of his friendship to me that he wants to share something that is deeply important to him. And I'm free to say no. And not that he does it a lot, but I generally my answer is no. It's not going to happen. I think he realizes that. But I came to see it as an act of love and friendship from him, that he wants to share something that he considers to be beautiful. And I think that's how we should view it, that we shouldn't be threatened by it. We live in a free society, and people should share their deepest convictions without us. If we're comfortable with where we are in our own faith or lack of faith, we shouldn't be so bothered. We can always say, that's very interesting, I'm happy to learn more, but ultimately, that's not my path, and that's okay.
Well, first, let me just ask everyone to pray for me, because I hope that one day someone asks me if I am a traveling evangelist. That is now my highest aspiration. So thank you. I really agree with what Shadi said. And here I think a lot about my work in international religious freedom and the many countries around the world where proselytizing, including Israel, incidentally, where proselytizing is not legal or not fully legal. And I think this is an area, like with freedom of religion in general, where we really want to err on the side of freedom here. I think it's a fundamental right. I think there's a lot of practical problems with trying to restrict it, like driving it underground and so forth. I don't think any of that's good, but I think that it's really important for us to protect that very important part of people's faith, of sharing their own faith. Now, the footnote here is that we don't want to allow, of course, people to be coercive, and there are gray areas. So, and I'm not defending this, but the Indian government had made a change in policy that ended up effectively expelling the largest aid organization in India, which was a Christian organization, and they were accused of, I think the term that kind of went around like in the policy world was like rice evangelism. Basically the accusation that there's a subtle coercion that you feed desperately poor people, and through feeding them, you end up bringing them to Jesus. And I don't think that's a fair description of the picture. And so I want to acknowledge that there are, and I'm not saying I see that as the hardest of cases or such a gray area, but I do want to acknowledge there are gray areas. But I think what we want to be really careful about is not expanding the definition of coercion. So coercion is definitely out, and this will be true in many, many contexts. There's a United States Supreme Court case, I think it's 1990, early 90s, Lee versus Weissman, where it was a public school graduation, and the public school had a kind of a rotation each year of different religious leaders come in, and the Supreme Court at the time ruled that it was a violation of the separation of church and state, a violation of the Establishment Clause, because having minors, I guess they were high school seniors, largely minors, there at a graduation ceremony where a pastor might give a religious prayer, and this was monitored by. This was the situation was crazier than you could think, because the school had guidelines for the pastors and rabbis and priests about how to give non-sectarian prayer. And of course, the year that this comes up, you have like a secular Jewish family suing the school over a rabbi coming and giving the prayer. Right? It's absolutely bonkers. But right, what was wrong with that case was like a massive overexpansion of what's considered coercion. And I think that's where we get into the same, whether it's a high school football coach taking a knee at the 50-yard line before a game. And I think the United States Supreme Court was right on that, that these things are in the realm of free expression and not in the realm of coercion.
So I want to make sure to leave time for audience questions here, but I just want to ask one last thing, sort of following up on some of this discussion, and especially the sort of pushback on secularization, which is sort of how you're thinking about that. So maybe secularization is the wrong term, but I think Shadi, as you sort of mentioned, the numbers over the, since the 90s or so on church attendance, regular church attendance, or the percent of people reporting no religion on surveys. Certainly, church attendance has gone way down. People reporting no religion has gone substantially up, maybe plateaued, but certainly not returned to anything like where it was. So maybe secularization is the wrong word, but what is that phenomenon?
I think you can call it de-Christianization, de-churching. There's various words that are less loaded than secularization that you could give it. I think it, to some degree, it can be exaggerated, because what you see is a much more rapid disaffiliation by people who were loosely affiliated versus people who are going to church consistently stopping. So the decline in Christian identification is steeper than the decline in Christian practice. And there is, like, the U.S. is not turning into Scandinavia or even France. Like, there's a really resilient core of not only Christian, but especially Christian practice and belief. I guess I see it, though, right now as ushering in, again, to your point about, like, you know, the advertisements for which therapy groups, it's ushering, like, there was a period, a kind of Obama-era period of real sort of secular progressive confidence that there was no God, but there was still an arc of history. And progressives, you know, the God who didn't exist, nonetheless had guaranteed that, you know, progressivism was going to dominate the future. That's all gone now. As far as I can see, American progressivism is in a dark, even despairing mood with visions of not just political apocalypse, but like literal apocalypse, climate change, and so on, haunting the secular imagination. And so you just have this, again, I said this before, but I'll say it again, you have this really fragmented and complicated landscape where one moment it feels natural for conservative Christians and Muslims to make common cause against, you know, some form of woke politics, and the next moment they're at each other's throats over whether Muslims should be Americans at all. And you can have both of those things happen within the same, like, 6-month period, right? And in a similar way, you can have a moment where the left looks super secular and anti-religious, and a moment where you're like, actually, maybe there's some weird spiritualist neo-paganism flourishing in the absence of Christianity. And all of this, like, this is my last riff, but I'll just riff for a second, right? Like, my pet view is basically that there's a lot of people out there right now who are, you know, can't get their minds fully around the old religions, the old, you know, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, the idea that, you know, there's a God and there's a revelation and a holy book and a set of rules. They can't get their mind around that. Like, that's too high up and far away to be real. But they're looking for something intermediate, something that's spiritual, maybe a little bit divine, but somewhere in between God up there and us down here. And it's kind of a 1970s vibe, right? It's like psychedelics, it's UFO fascinations, it's paganism, it's witchcraft, it's spells, it's astrology, it's this, like, half-ironic, like, do I really believe in the goddess or not? You know, who knows, but I'm playing around with it. And then AI, the AI stuff is sort of shadowing this too. So it's a really weird, interesting, from a traditionally religious perspective, full of promise and full of danger moment, I think, right? Where it's like, you know, from one perspective, it's, if you're traditionally religious, it's like people are really open to religious and spiritual arguments. From another perspective, you're like, and maybe they're consorting with demons on the weekends. And both of these things could be true. And yeah, and the last thing I'll say is that, of course, Shadi is right, and that, you know, God's going to sort it all out in the end.
I'll just add something very quickly. I mean, just even think about the name Soul Cycle. Have you guys ever thought about that? The spirituality is literally in its name. People are ostensibly just cycling for an hour to, like, music, and you wouldn't think that's particularly spiritual, but it does have a spiritual significance for people, at least some of the people who take part in it, and even the founders had this sort of in the back of their minds with the naming of it. And there's so many things that are like that are sort of secular but also spiritual simultaneously, which shows the spiritual yearning has not been extinguished. We want something more. We want to feel like it's not just about ourselves as little atomized beings. And that kind of struggle for meaning, that yearning for meaning, doesn't seem to be going anywhere. And just to return to what I said earlier, the only question is where we direct that yearning. Not that yearning is there or not, because it seems to be that it is there.
And along the lines of what both of you were saying, the deinstitutionalization of religion, but also I think it's just so increasingly consumeristic, both on the end of, I cannot tell you the number of real people in my life I know who have posted on Instagram that they paid a TikTok witch to make sure that there was sun on their wedding and not rain, which is a purely just, you know, it's just transactional. It's like, I'm paying you some money to do this spiritual thing for me. Sounds a lot, honestly, like a lot of MAGA Christianity, too. Like, I employ these Christian symbols for the benefit it gets me. If I pray, it's to ask God to bless my movement, and I benefit politically because I'm aligned with God. I think there's just both the deinstitutionalization of there's not religious leaders that can call out most of this stuff, but also it's obviously always been true. I mean, I as a Christian believe that humans since the beginning have been bent towards our own desires, and yet I think that deinstitutionalization, the separation from a lot of our tradition or grounding in a particular tradition has led to, I'm yearning for something, someone is selling it, and that is the easiest way to get it, is to give them money for the thing I want, not to submit myself to either a human authority, or I would say even more importantly, to a divine authority.
And in a way, that is actually the real old time, like before Western monotheism came along, like transactional religion is really, really ancient too.
Let's open it up to audience questions. Lily has a microphone here.
Okay, that's very intimidating to be the first question. So thank you very much for this beautiful discussion. I was wondering what you would say to a fifth character that was not on your panel, but who would be very sympathetic to your general outlook. A non-believer who agrees with the negative effects of secularization and the lack and disorientation, but who cannot quite come over to embracing fully a religious worldview, but thinks that we kind of have to come together and have some kind of communion. And I'm kind of like wondering, what can you say intellectually to somebody in that position who wants to kind of share with you guys, but is not entirely intellectually ready to be there?
Who wants to proselytize? We'll let the Jew do the proselytization.
Just in case they won't say it, I will say that Jesus is waiting for you with open arms. So, not looking for people on my team, but I have one to recommend. So that's definitely. But you were careful at the end, and I appreciate you said, what could you say intellectually? And fortunately, there are intellectuals here on the panel with me, and so maybe they want to take it up. But I would say that to stall until somebody else will start to speak, I will just say that I think that that inchoate recognition that secularism or unbelief is not enough is already the first step down the road to discovering the truths, the mustard seed, if you will, that will get you the whole way.
So I would say that you don't have to believe right away. A starting point can be acting as if you believe, which is different. And I do know some recent converts to Catholicism, that if you ask them, do you believe everything in Catholic doctrine, they would say no, at least not yet. But we want to take part in the ritual. We want to kind of do the work. And there's something similar in Islam too, that if you walk towards God, God runs towards you. So you do a couple of the early... sorry, I know this sounds like proselytizing, but I'm just saying that this idea that belief has to be 100% certain before you take part in religious practices, I think is a little bit misleading. If you ask a lot of people, do they believe in everything that is required by the orthodoxy of their faith, you'll find quite a bit of divergence. But what they are committed to is the practice, the going, the taking part in community. And I think then, you try that out and then you see what happens. And I mean, I'll defer to Daniela on this, but I also this is definitely not something that happens in Islam, but my understanding is that you can be an Orthodox Jew and not believe in God. Actually, that happens.
Well, a Jew certainly. Yes, let's say Jew without the modifier. You can certainly be Jewish and not believe in God.
No, but people who take part in the ritual and they observe the Sabbath, they do all of that. The eating habits are in line with kosher expectations. But if you ask them, do you believe in God, they might not be 100% sure. That's possible, okay. Right?
Yeah. Yes.
There's also a Jewish tradition that would say that's not even an interesting question.
Yeah, also
right? Like we have the law. Why do we need to worry about?
That's right.
I've had.
Yeah. I'll keep kosher, and God will sort out whether he exists.
Yeah. I mean, I mean, there also is, look, like, this is sort of the opposite of the actual argument that I tend to address to non-believers, but there is, in fact, a long, illustrious tradition in American life of people who think that religion is good because it's good for you and are not themselves especially religious, do not themselves believe, but sort of accept religion as this kind of civic good that you welcome in society. You try and mitigate its intolerance and its harms and so on, but you just sort of take it for granted that it's a thing that's an important part of the civic fabric. You don't want it to go away. You want to be in dialogue with religious people, even if you yourself don't believe. And there's the famous Dwight Eisenhower line, right? It's something like, the American experiment only makes sense in the light of a strong religious faith, and I don't care what it is, right? Which is, 1950s religion and so on. But this is a big, sprawling, messy republic. There's a place for people who are friendly to religion, who are not themselves religious, and there always will be that place. But having said that, I do also have to make the pitch that there almost certainly is a God. Really, I really promise there almost certainly is. And, it's okay to accept that possibility, as Shadi said, without necessarily being at all certain about where that takes you next.
Someone wrote a book on that.
That was my last.
Read
book.
Ross's book.
Yeah.
I want to explicitly raise the question of technology, and I'll give you two threads to pull on that you can choose from. One is related to Ross's book, Decadence. So you sort of predicted a decadent period, both culturally and religiously. But then since you wrote that book, there's been sort of the rise of a new god, artificial intelligence, and so I wonder how you would update that now. And the other thread is, you mentioned, Shadi, 1998 is the year that the decline in religiosity in the U.S. began, and sort of implied that that's resulted in a crueler society. What if we assume that one didn't cause the other, but both were caused by the rise of the internet, which became ubiquitous in 1998? And if religion was going to deal with the problem of cruelty, would have to do it by dealing with the internet and how we incorporate that or don't or whatever. So two threads, technology.
I'll let the others handle the larger internet question, but just on the specific point about decadence, yes, I wrote a book that came out literally like 2 weeks before a global plague swept the world, where I said, man, we're stuck in cycles of repetition and drift, and nothing new ever seems to happen. So it's an example of how, God laughs at all these things. But I do tend to think that not just AI alone, but AI in particular, could represent something that takes us beyond decadence into some genuinely new and challenging and different and maybe apocalyptic era with all kinds of questions for how society works, but also religious questions as well. At the same time, like, if AI sort of stalled out where it is right now, I think it's pretty easy to see how it could actually ratify decadence, right? You just, you end up, with AI slop everywhere, and nobody reads anymore, and you can run down. So I think it's sort of, I think decadence could be going away and giving way to a new dispensation. I'm very open to that possibility, but it could also reassert itself. But the internet is like this larger question is really important.
Obviously, it plays a role. I think a lot of things happened around 2000. So we also have to factor in 9/11, the Iraq War, the Bush years, and it's hard to kind of disentangle. But certainly I think that with the internet, you have less need in quotation marks, for going to religious institutions, because you have this whole parallel world that you can build for yourself, and you're distracted. You have things to do. There was a time when people were bored, so they had to actually go out and do things to relieve their boredom. But when you have the internet, you have a perpetual answer to that question of boredom. So And then, of course, the rise of smartphones, I think, accelerates some of these negative effects. So starting around 2008. That said, if you look at Muslim majority countries, which had very high internet penetration post 2010, let's say, you don't necessarily have a corresponding drop in religious belief or religious observance or religious attendance. So if the internet was the kind of all-encompassing answer to this, you would have seen more consistent effects across different geographies and different religious traditions, but you don't necessarily see that. So I think it is a really tough question. I think the answer it's the answer to most, I think, difficult questions. There are multiple factors, and this is certainly one of them.
Thank you so much for all of you being here. I love the discussion, the wisdom, the pursuit of truth in this dialogue, so thank you. You're here in the heart of a university, and I'm wondering about how the role of higher education particularly plays a role in adjudicating a lot of these questions and concerns. The university, of course, we heard from the very beginning, is taking certain stances, this institution in particular, about promoting dialogue. And this institution in 1894, famously, if you go up Bascom Hill, says this, it's on the wall. Whatever may be the limitations which trammel inquiry elsewhere, we believe that the great state University of Wisconsin should ever encourage that continual and fearless sifting and winnowing by which alone the truth can be found. And so I'm wondering what you think about the role of the university, particularly in pursuit of this truth, wisdom. How can the university help us navigate these times? Thank you.
Well, I think the university can only do it if it is its best self. And just to link back to the last question, the role of AI, thinking of ChatGPT usage. And I'm so busy thinking about technology and education that I don't have developed thoughts on technology and religion right now. There was a stat recently that just on the campus network, we're up to like 1.3 million unique hits per week on ChatGPT. And that's not even if the student's on the cell data on the phone, just if they're on the campus network.
On which camp?
At my campus.
What? Just on your campus?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's a number that, which as a professor said to me, that means, to connect to you asked me beforehand, like, that means they're not only asking ChatGPT on the way to class to summarize the reading for them, but also, like, how do I ask this person on a date, and what should I wear tonight, and, like, all of these
We should be
things
so lucky that they're asking for advice on how to go on a date, honestly.
Maybe, yeah, although that's true. Relaying the story as it was said to me. So, and of course, universities have a lot of challenges besides this, but it's a prominent one and one we were just discussing. I mean, there's a certain way in which I have hope, meeting young people every day. Because it's a point of pride, I will say that in the spring, when I realized that the president, both of the college Republicans and the college Democrats, were students of mine who I was extremely fond of and very close with, and who were also friends with each other, I didn't even ask them. I just emailed them. I said, we're having a debate early in the fall. And I, to everyone who, in the planning, the advertising, this is framed as an opportunity to show everyone that we can disagree and still be friends. Of course, it turns out that the date was 6 days after the killing of Charlie Kirk, in which case it was obviously even more important frame of that. But we booked, it was a room like this, seats 200 people, $1,200 of Chick-fil-A, and we had about 350 students come to that room, and the event was a huge success. And of course that event was not about religion, but it was striking a blow for dialogue. And I think that's really important, both over the religious secular divide, which is a big one, but also across the faiths. And so I think that if enough people, and I don't know if enough people are, but if enough people are committed to that, it's obviously, we are forming the next generation. I guess it's a cliche, but there is a chance.
I would say that $350 or $200 of Chick-fil-A is like
$1,200
maybe
of Chick-fil-A.
$1,200 of Chick-fil-A is a really important part of that answer, in that for lots of reasons, in my experience, especially with like undergrads at Duke, has been the challenge is not is the university doing enough to educate or to facilitate conversation? But is the university doing enough to address the fact that most of them, in part because of the internet, are not only like physically exhausted, like they're not sleeping enough, they're not with people in person and often enough, but also when it comes to their engagement with politics, most of the things that they are consuming online are both flooding them with way more information than they possibly have any agency to do anything about, but convincing them that it is hopeless, that they should have a fatalistic attitude. I mean, the number of times I've been at interfaith or, political events on campus where most of the students come for the food and then also are just, like, even when they're in the kinds of sharp disagreements that a lot of coverage has been dedicated to talking about, the kinds of disagreements where you might think, like, this is the real conflict on campus. It seems like they're too exhausted to even care that much about it. And on one hand, there's a weird, satisfaction in going, like, we're not coming to fists here in this moment. But the heartbreak that I have is both that they are not given the resources they need, and I think those are largely spiritual resources, to metabolize the information they're receiving or to have the wisdom to opt out of some of the information they're receiving. But they also don't have the kind of community that historically has given you a space to exercise some kind of even limited agency. Like, the heartbreak I see is the students who are going, I've joined 5 campus organizations to try and do something politically. None of those have any real space for any kind of spiritual practice to sustain that. But they also don't have a space for doing something on the kind of human-sized scale that might actually satisfy a human soul, like showing up at a church across the street that says, I don't know that you can fix the government shutdown right now, but you can bake a casserole for someone whose leg was just broken, or you can teach a Sunday school class and really impact the lives of a bunch of second graders, or that lot. Like, if everything is at the scale that it tends to happen at, including very often in universities, because people are trying to say, like, look so globally and think so large politically, you end up with just exhausted, completely demotivated students. And in my experience, the ones that walk across the street to the church and have an opportunity to exercise some kind of agency where they actually impact the community they're in, they might actually be able to consume more of the national news that's going on or get involved in a campaign that's dealing with something on a larger scale because they've been not only given spiritual resources to deal with that, but some practice of knowing what it's like to be a human that has agency in the world that they're in.
So, similar question, different lane. I work at a large evangelical church, and while a lot of churches have split along political divides, our church has remained really nonpartisan, and so we have people in our congregation on every end of the political spectrum. But what we've noticed, especially as of late, is that because we've got this political diversity within our community, that while that is happening, and in the broader culture, a lot of these cross political debates have become really vitriolic, and for some people the conversation can feel existential, and so it's taken on this intensity that is making its way into church spaces as well. And so with that being the case, what would you say is the responsibility of church leaders in helping their congregations both to be better representatives of in this case, of Christ to one another, but also to be better citizens in culture broadly?
I thought Shadi said something very important before about the ultimacy. Right? Politics is not ultimate, and there's a way. This is part of the Jewish tradition as well. David Novak of University of Toronto has written about this very powerfully, but that religion is so important because it reminds us that politics is not ultimate. It also means that the state is not ultimate and all-powerful. And so I would say, without, again, telling your religious tradition how to do its job, probably the first message is that, and the vacuum also that Shadi talked about, right? That's when I don't think it's a thing about the left or the right, but that politics becomes personal, right? That it becomes, in the same way that, I have a brother, God bless him, who's, an unbeliever, and like his football team is like kind of his religion, right? Because it's like you could, and he moved from the East Coast to the West Coast, and he found a bar out there, where that's like for his team, for his New York team. And it's like, do you not see that you guys are getting together on Sunday morning in your gear every week? So whatever, right? I would say that's the first thing. And then, of course, there are many other things I think that you can talk about how to have political conversations in a Christ-like manner. And this, of course, for any faith, that it has to start with love and willing the good of the other, and it shouldn't happen in caps lock on social media, but should happen, one-on-one over a religiously appropriate beverage. And but others here can speak to that.
I think part of the response is just a factual assessment that it's not actually existential. At least in this country, which is still a mostly free and democratic country, politics does not threaten your very existence. It might make your life worse if the other candidate or party wins. I'm not denying that. Your life could be significantly worse, but for the vast majority of us, it is not actually threatening your very existence. People really, I think, just have to get that in their minds. And that's why I don't like this discourse. It happens every election when people will say, this is the most important election of our lifetime, which factually cannot be true. You can't have every election being the most important election of your lifetime. There's only one. So I just think we have to push back when we hear that kind of overheated rhetoric and just be like, guys, calm down. Is it actually as bad as you think it is? Is it actually existential?
I think... I completely agree, but part of the challenge is that, we started this discussion, and we've referenced the civil rights era several times, right? And of course, the civil rights era was a period when there were a lot of Christian and religious leaders who were like, look, this is an overheated topic that is dividing our churches. And, it's better for the church not to take a big stand on it. It divides our communities and our congregations. And, in hindsight, generally people look back and say, well, those churches failed the test, right? And, the churches that were sending people out to protest passed the test. And I think it is fair to say that there are historical moments and issues where to be a serious Christian or a serious religious believer, you have to have a stance on issues, right? Like, you can't just say politics isn't as important as ultimate questions, because politics is important and questions of justice are really important. I guess, like, what I tend to urge is exercises that try to make people on the opposite side of issues understand why the person on the opposite side from them sees one set of issues as central, and they see one set of issues as central, and they both have good arguments on their side, right? And I write a conservative column for a liberal-leaning newspaper, so I move back and forth. Hush, between different worlds, and it's really striking how, like, there are the parallel, like, if I'm among pro-life Christians, right, it's very easy to understand how pro-life Christians can think to themselves, there is no issue more important than abortion. It's an issue of life and death. If the church isn't taking a stand on this issue, it's not doing anything at all, right? But then you move from that world to a world of people who have all kinds of reasons to oppose Donald Trump. It's very easy to come up with, I think, serious religious reasons to be appalled by aspects of the Trump era, right? And I think a big question is, can you get people from both sides to sort of see that world? And it so often seems striking to me that, like, people they struggle to see why someone would place a different issue from them and make that issue central. It's really hard for people to see that. And maybe there's work that churches can do just on that point, to say, look, I'm not saying you're wrong to privilege opposition to Trump or privilege opposition to abortion. I'm just asking you to try to understand why someone ends up coming down in a different place from you. I don't know, but it's very, very hard. It's very hard.
The thing I would add along the lines of your question about being Christ-like, coming from many evangelical churches, is and this is not unique to evangelicals, but I do think there's some theological reasons this tends to be true of evangelicals and some historical reasons this tends to be true of evangelicals, that so much of our political formation is both outsourced. So while there's a lot of coverage of the very political churches who will sing a Make America Great Again hymn or whatnot, more often is true of evangelical churches that they are silent on political issues, and then people get their not just political but their spiritual formation from, say, Fox News. I think that tends to be the larger and often more conservative evangelical churches. So that's one part, is we tend to outsource our political formation, and we tend to focus exclusively on conclusions. So I have been in so many churches across, from conservative evangelical churches to more progressive evangelical churches, that pass out voter guides, or at least someone leaves them on the windshields of cars outside after the service, that basically just pair Bible verses with policies. And that's the extent of our formation. We're not often formed in both, how do we come to the conclusions we come to? So if a new political situation presented itself, you would have a theological, a biblical way of coming to a conclusion on it. But we also don't have a lot of formation in the kind of people we need to be to sustain the political work that we might need to do. Along the lines of what Ross was saying, even if there is a church that says, or a subset of a church that says, we are really certain about this policy issue. Like, we think it is really important. It is life and death. It is an issue of justice. It's an issue of the sanctity of human life, whatever it is. Even if they're really sure of that, have they been formed to be the kind of people that know how to face opposition on that, know what to do when they lose the battle, whether it's electing someone or getting some kind of decision passed in a court or whatever it is? Do they know how to lose well? Do they know how to treat their opponents well? I wish, I get asked professionally constantly to go to mostly evangelical churches and give either like a Tuesday night talk on politics or something like that, which is a terrible idea, because if you advertise Tuesday night talk about politics at any church, like, people come ready to fight on Tuesday night. That's what they come ready for. But I'll often tell the pastors who ask me to come, what I'd love to do actually is meet with your elders, deacons, Sunday school teachers, whoever the leaders are, from little kids to the oldest people in the church, and just spend some time talking about what are Christian theological resources for the means we engage in politics in, for the character we need to do this well, for the spiritual resources we need to sustain ourselves when things are really hard. Because what I have seen, particularly amongst evangelicals, but I'm sure it's true in lots of other historical periods, other traditions, is people generally go into politics with very good intentions. And to Ross's point, they might be a really pro-life person who goes in because they're really convicted about the sanctity of human life. The same could be true on the progressive end. They really get into criminal justice reform because they're really concerned about the sanctity of human life. And they start out very principled. And over time, because the stakes seem so extreme, and because their opponents are mean to them sometimes, and things are really hard, and they get beat up on the internet, and over time, that corrupts their soul, and they didn't mean to end up that way. They thought if they had the right political conclusions at the beginning, and right because Scripture told them or God told them it was true, then they would end up doing the faithful thing at the end and never pause to ask, well, what if I'm right about a bunch of things, but I become a horrible person by the end of it? I can't actually get anything done, and I've lost my soul in the process. And that, I wish, would be our goal in the churches. It's like, how do we engage in politics without losing our souls, which will be a real challenge in the political world we live in.
I would just say, to the question about the internet, which I think is connected to this, the internet is a machine for convincing you that your political opponents are the worst human beings who ever lived. And it is an incredibly efficient device for doing that. All of the algorithms, all of the reinforcement, it's all geared around, like, if you're a conservative, you will be fed 6 images from the No Kings protest that are the worst, like the person who's like making fun of Charlie Kirk getting shot in the neck, like that's all you'll get of the No Kings protest. And if you're a liberal, you will get nothing but, like, all Republicans are racist, groyper, like, monsters, right? That is a place where I think churches should, like, it's not about the specifics of politics. It's about telling people, as Christians, you need to discipline how you use the internet, and you need to be aware that there is a fundamentally satanic element to how social media sort of disciples people and teaches them about their political enemies that people just have to be aware of.
Just so we don't finish on that note, because I know. I just want to reiterate that Jesus is waiting for you with open arms.
All right. Well, on that note.
No good.
All right. Well, on that note, I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. Ross, Danielle, Shadi, Kaitlyn. Thank you all for being part of this. And I hope this is not the end of the conversation. I hope this conversation will continue beyond this. So thank you all, and I look forward to engaging more on this.
You have been watching a production of Wisconsin Eye, your unfiltered window into legislative deliberations and public policy programming, where our mission is to provide Wisconsinites an opportunity to access the legislative process and connect with conversations that inform our citizenry. Please consider supporting our mission, and thank you for watching. Wisconsin Eye, policy made public.